this is probably a historical perspective, but I think there's been this notion over the years that salespeople can just handle it. Those are the people who naturally handle stress. They stepped into a role where they have quota. They are bulletproof when it comes to these things. Jason, that's not the case. They feel the anxiety, they feel the angst, and it affects them. There's just no way you could think as a manager or leader of a sales organization, if your people are being compromised from a well-being perspective, that they're going to A, continue to perform at a high level, and B, even remain with you. Those are the type of people who out of the blue just quit on you, and which is the last thing that you want. So I really do think, and it's one of the reasons we're taking a closer look at it in academia, I think that, and maybe this is the future of the sales organization, I think that organizations that are better at focusing on their people from that perspective are going to be well positioned, because I think it's going to come to matter more and more in the future.
Hey everybody, Jason here again, final conversation portion with Dr. John Hanson from the University of Alabama at Birmingham. For anybody just catching this and you missed the first two parts, you're like, I don't need authenticity or persuasion, I just want to know about the future. You're wrong. Go check out those other two, I will say, because you have to have that strong foundation. And John dropped a lot of gems in the first two parts, so much good stuff that I took notes. Whether you're catching the full episodes or soundbite clips from this, like there's a lot of great stuff that he said. But also make sure to check out his bio. So he is a director of the Center of Professional Selling. He's also professional marketing at UAB. He was at University of Southern Mississippi, Northern Illinois University, which had sales programs, got his PhD from University of Alabama, and now he's teaching sales. He's helping influence the future of salespeople, and he's here to share all of that with us. Now, before we get into kind of the standard questions I would ask about the future of sales and what that means to you and what people want more of and less of, I want to bring up something I alluded to at the end of part 2, which is about salespeople being ambidextrous, and then also where that fits in with their well-being, because I think it's super important to always be focusing on mental health and well-being for humans. And then sales is a different challenging category and game that people play.
Yeah. And we talked a little bit earlier about this. And I think the fact that at least in higher ed, we're becoming more and more focused on well-being is evidenced by the fact we have a special journal publication that we're working on, focused specifically on well-being. And I'll be honest with you, when I started in sales way back in the 90s, there was not much talk about salesperson. You just went out and posted results. And if you did, you were successful in sales. And if you didn't post results, you found another career. And clearly times have changed. And this next generation of salesperson has grown up differently than I did and is very focused on this, as they should be. We're currently doing some research where we are looking at salesperson ambidexterity. That is the natural inclination of some individuals to simultaneously engage in differing types of tasks. Specifically, and very common to sales, is the hunter versus the farmer, who's good at going out and getting the new business versus who's good at maintaining and further cultivating existing relationships. And we're looking at that, and we're trying to understand, first and foremost, is this a positive thing when it comes to well-being, or might this present challenges as it relates to well-being? We actually find that salesperson ambidexterity, that is those individuals who, at least through data gathered, would suggest that they both are hunters and farmers. They at least have this orientation to do both. They feel higher levels of stress. So that's number one. Number two, we find that this relationship grows even stronger. That is, it is more problematic when they are in a role that simultaneously has both a selling focus and a service focus. And I think when you hear that, it makes sense. You basically have these layering of tasks onto the role. Now, you could have individuals who are inclined to engage in both hunting and farming activities, but clearly they're going to be in a role that primarily emphasizes one of those things. But yet that natural inclination to try to do everything in a relationship. I don't know if you've ever been in a relationship where you're trying to do everything, or known someone who tries to do everything in a relationship. It's exhausting. And I think That's what we are seeing. And I also think it raises this issue of assuming ambidexterity is a good thing. And you want salespeople to be doing all of these things. I think it's very difficult to simultaneously be good at both, finding and beginning new relationships and managing existing ones. You're asking a lot of the person. Those are two very different tasks. Very different tasks. So the fact that we're finding that creates stress among salespeople does not surprise me. And the fact that, especially in today's business environment where services, it has to be there. You have to provide the level of service necessary. And if you're in a role where you don't have someone else handling the service component for you, it becomes too much. You're just exhausted based on everything you're doing. We also look at managerial control system in terms of, are they on an output-based system where you're just evaluated based on whether or not you're hitting the number, or is it activity-based and they're looking at those things that you do? And we find that to the extent that it is outcome-based and it's just kind of focused on, did you get it done or not? There's even heightened levels of stress on that. So I think in that research, we see a couple of things. There's the recruitment to fit piece. And I know obviously companies today are doing much more fit work as they go through the interview process to find out what type of position someone might fit well to. Just thinking or assuming that because someone fits well to multiple roles, they can do a little bit of everything, that's not a sound strategy. Number two, you also need to be very careful when you look at activities required in the role. And if you have salespeople out there in roles where they still have the sales goals, but they are the ones carrying the burden of the service that's being delivered to the customer, that's a tough lift, because in today's business world, the service requirements are more pronounced than they ever were. And then number three, you really do need to give thought to, how are we evaluating and rewarding our people? The output-based system requires the least managerial effort. That's always been the draw. Look, you either hit your number or you don't. And to the extent that you hit your number and go beyond quota, we're going to pay you out. And all that matters are outcomes. The activity-based approach, wherein you're like, if you're doing this and doing this and doing this, we think this leads to success, is more cumbersome from a managerial perspective, because you're having to track all of those activities. But yet, at least in the context we're seeing, it lessens that feeling of stress and anxiety and enhances salesperson well-being. I think it's pretty interesting, some of those things that we're seeing, particularly as it relates to this topic that historically hasn't been looked at to a great extent, salesperson well-being.
Such an important topic. And I can see all those things that you were speaking about playing out in organizations where it just causes that stress. People have a tendency for what they like. Are they short-term? Are they long-term? One of the things that I've told a lot of companies about is, when you're recruiting and interviewing, part of what you want to do is build your process like your sales process, like you're interviewing, which means if it's a short sales cycle, then you should have a short hiring process, because you're looking for someone that is thinking in that mode. If you have a long sales cycle, you have to find people who are long-term salespeople. If you're looking for service people, it's long-term, right? The sale is just the beginning. Now it's all about lifetime value and long-term relationship. And when you ask somebody to do both of those roles, where they're having to find new business and then service that business, it doesn't work, because someone's going to gravitate one way or another. They're either going to be the hunter that's out there closing new business, and then that business absolutely falls apart and it's just garbage and everything is missing, or they can't get new business. If they do have any, people love them, they do everything right. It's really difficult to find somebody who can do both. And I would say that's mostly not possible. And I love your approach on it. Like, I've always built teams where we have, some people call it the fronter or the SDR or whatever that is in your industry. And then you have the actual consultative person. But I love the fact that you're talking about from a well-being, a mental health, not even just an effectiveness. I always look from effectiveness, but you're talking about what is the mental well-being and stress placed on that individual when you're putting a square peg in a square hole and a round hole at the same time.
This is probably a historical perspective, but I think there's been this notion over the years that salespeople can just handle it. Those are the people who naturally handle stress. They stepped into a role where they have quota. They are bulletproof when it comes to these things. Jason, that's not the case. they feel the anxiety, they feel the angst, and it affects them. There's just no way you could think as a manager or leader of a sales organization, if your people are being compromised from a well-being perspective, that they're going to A, continue to perform at a high level, and B, even remain with you. Those are the type of people who out of the blue just quit on you, and which is the last thing that you want. So I really do think, and it's one of the reasons we're taking a closer look at it in academia, I think that, and maybe this is the future of the sales organization, I think that organizations that are better at focusing on their people from that perspective are going to be well positioned, because I think it's going to come to matter more and more in the future.
It makes sense. And obviously you're in the middle of the research and getting that done, but how would an organization set that up for success?
I think, first of all, to our research, the importance of fit to role cannot be overemphasized. And I know a lot of companies are well ahead on this, and they are performing the test as they go through the interview process to really try and figure out who is this person and what type of role do they fit best to. Now, not everybody is there, but I think more and more organizations are doing it. I do think we have a lot of salespeople out there who fail, not because they can't sell, but rather because they're in the wrong role. So I think anytime you can get somebody in the right role, whether it's getting new business, managing existing business, being service oriented, being whatever it is, I think that's a good thing. I personally think it might relate well to this call. I think starting inside, there are benefits. I cannot tell you how many, and this is somewhat anecdotal, but I cannot tell you how many young salespeople I talk to who have left the college campus just excited as they can be about the fact that they're going to have all this autonomy, and they're living in Nashville, Tennessee, while their manager is in Dallas, Texas. And they're like, man, this is great. They're on an island. They feel isolated. They don't know their coworkers. They feel as though they're a little detached from their company. They know their customers better than they know their own company. They feel as though they're not really gaining any effect in terms of learning from others who work beside them. That isolation is real. And I think it's one of the real benefits to starting inside, getting to know the company, getting to know those other people you came into the organization with. I actually think that's a good thing. It provides a nice foundation. So even those two things, I would suggest, are highly practical things organizations could look at to at least get their people off to a strong start as it relates to well-being. Then you have a big component as you continue to move forward. And this is a challenging one. I don't have specific advice on it. How do you manage to well-being? How do you put this additional thing on the plate of your managers, some of whom have much more experience than others, where you're asking your sales managers to be highly sensitive to the well-being of their team? That's different for a lot of them. They haven't thought like that. They've been thinking about outcomes and posted results, and they view their people as a conduit for success. And there's more to it than that. So that's going to be a tough one moving forward, I think.
Yeah. And that is a challenge when somebody thinks the remote lifestyle will be good. It's so hard, especially with a new salesperson on a team, no matter how much experience they have, to understand, be a part of it. There's also so much that you get from being around the team and hearing things over a cubicle wall or in passing, and things you pick up that works, what doesn't work. And it is a tough one, especially until you have that confidence, like we talked about in the second part about process and persuasion.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the future of sales. What do buyers want more of, do you think, or do you forecast from salespeople?
I think that buyers, I'm going to go back to what I said previous in this notion that they want to buy as they want to buy. I think they are going to, not only do they want this today, but they're going to continue to want the right information at the right time as they go through their purchasing process. I think all of us would recognize the fact that in many instances today, salespeople are involved less in the process. Buyers are out doing research on their own, In some instances, they've done all this research and they're making decisions before the salesperson even realizes the decision is being made for someone who could be a vital customer in the territory. So I think moving forward, this ability of sales organizations on the whole, you got to look at the whole. How, as a sales organization, can we be adept at making sure we're providing our buyers the right information at the right time as they navigate their purchasing process, in some instances, without us? And I think that ties into something that everybody's talking about, but I think is real, the integration of technology into the sales process. This notion that it's not just a singular salesperson within the company managing the process. The idea that he or she is going to have to work with marketing, is going to have to work with digital, is going to have to work with these other facets of the firm in order to ensure that the organization as a whole is assisting the buyer as he or she navigates their purchasing process. I think that's where we're going. Now, at some point in that process, if it's done correctly by the organization, the salesperson will come into play. The human interaction will be there. But I'll be honest, we've done surveys recently with buyers where we have specified, in order to participate in this survey, we need you to spend 40% of your time with salespeople. And oftentimes we'll get comments and they'll say, well, what do you mean by that? I don't have nearly as much face-to-face time with sellers today as compared to back in the day. I think that's going to continue. And I think sales organizations are going to have to adapt to that. And it falls under the umbrella of letting buyers buy how they want to buy and adapting to that. But I think it also touches on this idea that sales, and I think a lot of us historically have viewed sales and said, we have salespeople out there who just do their thing on their own, and we call them the lone wolves in research. And they go post results, but they don't interact. They're not going to be able to make it anymore because it's going to take more effort across the organization to adapt to buyers as they continue to move down this path, because I don't think it's going to change.
And so what do you see salespeople and or organizations needing to do in the future and or now?
I think one of the key pieces is going to be when you talk about that important customer that's out there, that's making decisions that could or could not involve the selling organization based on the selling organization being top of mind. The question the sales organization is going to have to ask is, how can we be top of mind when we might not necessarily know where that buyer's at? So I think we're going to see more, again, integration of just in general sales and marketing. And it's going to be forced because sales and marketing in many cases in the past it's been anything but pretty. But I think sales people and sales organizations are going to have to recognize the fact that in order for us to be successful, this can't just be a communication strategy led by the salesperson alone. We have to touch the customer as the customer wants to be interacted with as they navigate their individual process. So I think there could be a digital component there. I think there's just general informational pieces that are going to have to be available and made available to the customer such that the customer can use it in their process. I would assume, and this is an area I don't know a lot about, so I'll just preface that. I would assume that in the future, organizations are going to have to make decisions with respect to individual customers and how do we serve that customer. Maybe there's customers out there we just serve through AI. I don't know. If they're not significantly large, perhaps that's what's happening. But I think it speaks to this infusion of technology into the sales process, the sales organization being open to it because they understand that the buyer's driving this. Now, is that all buyers? Not necessarily, but I think our research tells us there are many buyers out there who just simply do not physically interact with salespeople to the same extent that they used to. They just don't. And I think sales organizations are going to have to adapt to that in the future.
I know that you've done a lot of research, you've taught, you're teaching on the marketing side, you're running the sales program. What can organizations do to break down that marketing versus sales versus marketing, maybe even not even versus, but they just don't work well together on the same mission.
Yeah. And I'll just preface this with the old stereotype: sales thinks marketing is detached and doesn't understand the challenges the customer presents, and marketing thinks sales is aloof and doesn't want to use them, and sales thinks without them the company would dissolve. I hear these things all the time as I interact with both salespeople and marketers. I'll go back to something I mentioned earlier. I think the more that is done, especially early in the career, for a salesperson to integrate him or her with other functions in the organization, the better. We're seeing in companies, especially our more advanced ones, training that emphasizes job rotation. You never used to see that. You never used to see salespeople joining the organization and going and spending time with logisticians or marketers to better understand their world. You never saw that. So I think that's one piece that really helps. And to me, that's a thought world piece, because it's one thing as a salesperson to look at an organizational chart and look at organizational responsibilities and say, oh yeah, that's what marketing does. They get us a bunch of stuff that we use when we're with customers. You can't really gain a true understanding of what they go through on a daily basis if that's all you do. And the opposite holds true too. Marketers and logisticians, whoever it may be, they need to understand the realities that salespeople confront out there. So that's number one. I think number two, again, inside sales forces, and this notion that salespeople are starting within the organization as opposed to external to the organization is a good thing. Even if it's something as simple as co-location and you're in close proximity to other people who are going to be in these different functions moving forward, to the extent that you have relationships across functional lines, that's beneficial. I really think that is. I do think you have the structural positions that in more advanced firms exist, the channel manager role, for example, that really is that liaison between sales and marketing. When I think channel manager, in a lot of ways, I think of that person who's a conduit. It's his or her job to make sure that the sales force is acting upon marketing initiatives and such. So that's important. And I still think at the higher levels of the organization, there's something to be figured out with respect to the chief sales officer versus the CMO. And do you have a CRO? Are they both going into a chief revenue officer, or are they separate going into the CEO? From an academic perspective, it's easy for us to look at the marketing discipline and say, well, sales falls under marketing from a traditional perspective. But in most organizations, sales is a much larger function than marketing when you look at the number of people that are contained within it, and how that CMO CSO relationship exists and how priorities are sorted and evaluated based on that, I think is going to be very important. It's tough. If you don't have some level of synergy at the high levels, you're not going to have synergy at the lower levels.
And that's what we spoke about on one of the earlier parts, was leadership from the top down, setting the tone, and whether you need to get rid of everybody and start over, or can you do change management, and how much training is necessary. Same thing with this. I love that you brought this up, because if you have these silos, it's because somebody thinks they're different than somebody else, which means at the top, there's something leading to this. And I have some thoughts that actually go into why that is, but I love that, right? If you have a CRO, chief revenue officer type position, then that's marrying everything revenue related, which is marketing, sales, sometimes customer service, retention. Like, it's everything revenue related, which means everyone's focused on revenue and customer success and everything that's involved, instead of, like you said, sales thinking that if it wasn't for them, it'd be shut down. It's like, that's not quite how that works, because you can sell all you want, but if nobody actually fulfills anything, it's also going to get shut down, right? It doesn't work. And I think that's so important. I love what you said about bringing all those people together and integrating the sales and marketing in whatever that looks like. And that would be amazing if all companies did the cross training, kind of rotational, sit with this department. And it's foreign exchange programs. Well, if you've ever met a foreign exchange student or been one yourself, and you see another country or meet someone, you're like, oh, wait, it's not what I think in the news, or it's not what I thought it was. Like, I get to know you and empathize and understand. Same thing. Sales sits with marketing for enough time. They're like, oh, I get it. Okay, this is going to make me better at sales, and I want to help you get better at marketing.
Yeah, and I will say for the audience, the forward thinking companies we interact with, in terms of companies that hire from our university, they're doing this more and more.
Mm.
So I would suggest it's something that all companies give thought to. There's a term we use in our research. We call it mutual understanding. And to the extent that you can establish a true mutual understanding across functions, we always see a strong and significant effect as it relates to collaboration and then ultimately success across sales and marketing, to the extent that you can get that mutual understanding in place.
I love it. That's great. Final words, Dr. John, on what you're excited about with the future of sales.
I'm going to put it in my context. I'm just excited about this young generation of salespeople I see coming out. I'll say this. I think this group gets dinged on a bit. If you were just to look at their stereotypes, you would think they walk around all day long with their head buried in their phone and they don't want to interact or orally communicate with anyone. And while times have changed, I promise you, if you step foot on our campus and if you come into one of our classes, and if you step into any other campus that has a sales program and you see some of those top students, they are every bit as engaged, motivated as anyone that came from my generation or the generations that preceded. There's talent out there. Now, they have options, and landing that talent is not easy. And that's why we have companies that support us, and through that support, they gain, really intimate access to these students, such that they're building relationships with them 18 months in advance of graduation. You can't just show up for the career fair and think you're going to get the best people. You'll get people, but you're not going to get the best people. So I think the future is bright when you look at that group. I think they most certainly understand the role of technology in any process they lead on a daily basis. But again, I'll say it's, and this is a little bit of a pitch, it's a matter of getting them. And what are you going to do as an organization to gain access to those students who may have 5 offers going into their senior year, and really be able to spend time with them such that you're not showing up on a campus, if you're hiring on a campus, and by the time you get there, that group is gone and you're in our big middle, which there's some good students in the big middle, but they're not like the top group.
Got it. I love it. And I appreciate what you're saying about that future generation. And I think it's interesting because for people like us that are older, I think at this point now, which every generation goes through, it's like the young kids don't do what we used to do, and they're different, and they're blah, 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 fill in the blank. I promise when you and I were kids, it was the same thing as a whole, right? So there's part of that to separate, and you can't just generalize. There's some things that are somewhat true and shared a bit, but it's not a fair thing to cover everyone. And then also what I love too is you're talking about these students who are in this program, maybe taking the course because they have to, because it's a part of the marketing track, some of them really wanting to be there. The ones who are choosing this, they're choosing this as a career and a career path, and they want to be in it, and that's just going to be better. The ones who are in that middle, they're open to it, they're unsure, and then where could that lead them? Potentially better off as salespeople, like we talked about in the first one, because they're going to ask questions and they're not going to rely on their outgoingness and their salesiness, and they're going to approach things different. And I love that. And I think what I'm most excited about is programs like yourself. And I'm not just saying this as like a sales pitch for you, but it's the reason why I'm having you on the show, is because of the work that you're doing, even for that middle, even for the people who are like, I never want to be in sales. I have to take this class. This sucks. I'm going to get through it. It's my worst nightmare to do role play in front of people. I don't want to do it. No matter what, even if they leave with that same attitude, you're changing the way they see sales, and hopefully changing the way they are as buyers out there in the world and what they tolerate. And the less they tolerate the crappy stuff, the more that changes sales from both sides.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. There are positive things happening. Yeah, I still would say that the future is bright when you look at this next generation coming. They're different from us, but that's okay. In some ways, they're different in a good way. And I think the future is bright. Now, a whole nother conversation for another day is your ability to retain them, because they do think differently about jobs as compared to what we and the generations ahead of us did. So I think retention is going to become increasingly important with this next generation.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's just in general true with salespeople and retention, because sales has shifted, buyers have shifted. You have to shift the way you treat the salespeople, what you give them, and what's important to them as well. I think everything has to change in its own respective part of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And again, companies who are selling the same way they always have and treating their salespeople the way they always have, they're going to lose on either end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. Closing this out, people who want to connect with you, please make sure, if you're watching or listening to this, connect with Dr. John on LinkedIn. It's John Hansen, Hansen. You can Google him on there or search for him on LinkedIn. It's also going to be in the show notes, as well as the UAB, University of Alabama, Birmingham Professional Sales Program. The link is way too long. It'd be terrible if I read it, but you can Google it and find the program, or you can go in the show notes and find even more info there. Again, Dr. John, thank you for being here. And I say this, some people might think I just say this to say this, but I truly mean it. Thank you for changing the way sales is done and the future of sales and impacting them, mostly from a self-centered standpoint as a customer and as a buyer. I want to deal with sales professionals. And so that's why I appreciate it more than anything else. And what you're doing is shifting that. This is the first time in sales history with these kind of programs where it's intentionally shifting it on a broader scale. And I think that's an amazing thing. And I appreciate that. And I'm glad you went into academia despite thinking you couldn't be a professor, you didn't like research, you didn't like all that stuff. I'm glad you took the leap and did it anyway. So thank you.
It was a good choice for me, a very fortunate choice. And thank you for the opportunity today.
Yes, of course. And for everyone tuning in, make sure to check out more of the content, follow what Dr. John has online. If you're in that area and you want to get involved, please get involved, or you want to be a student. This is how we change the way that sales is done and shift it from being a dirty word into an actual profession. Someday it will be a profession. And as always, thank you for helping fill the world with authentic persuaders.